The Holy Bible is the most popular book of all time. It's a collection of stories that dictate the history of God and his people throughout time, and it is widely known by most people on the planet. Whether you believe in its teachings or you are bitterly opposed, it cannot be denied that the knowledge of its pages is core to much of society, as are the content of its stories. To this end, there are near infinite guides on how to best approach the Bible. There are essential guides for the newly converted, core tenets that are reviewed daily, reading plans, filler guides, but what you cannot find is an actual review of its contents, a critical analysis of what is a valuable moral lesson and what is a document of history. If we're going to approach the Bible, we need to start with its most important book, the book of Genesis. If you were to gauge someone's knowledge of the Bible, they could recite to you the story of the Exodus, the story of Jesus Christ from the New Testament, and maybe some loose passages from Deuteronomy, but it is undeniable that the vast majority of stories would be from the book of Genesis. Stories like creation, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Sodom and Gomorrah, and the binding of Isaac only begin to scratch the surface on the most expansive history dictated in the Bible, covering the beginning of time until the Israelites settle in the land of Goshen, where they would remain for 400 years. In order to rank the stories of Genesis, I had to first decide what constituted a story. There are some, such as Cain and Abel and the binding of Isaac, that take one of the 50 chapters of Genesis, with a definitive beginning, middle, and end. But then there are the Chronicles of Abram as he visits Egypt, or the story of Abraham's promised sons, Ishmael and Isaac, that constitute several chapters. All told, I was able to come to the conclusion that there are 23 stories in the book of Genesis. If there are smaller stories within amalgamations, like the story of Abraham, they will be addressed and contribute to the overall impression. With that out of the way, I present to you the definitive ranking of the book of Genesis. Let's talk about it. The bottom two stories I'm going to link together because they are basically the same. Chapters 5 and 10 detail family lines, with chapter 5 being slightly more novel as it is the initial population of the world, explaining the lineage from Adam and Eve to Noah, and chapter 10 being a bit more expansive, repopulating the world following the flood that wiped out all but Noah and his sons down to the Semitic descendant Abram. There are a lot of these segments in other stories, details about tribes and lineages that occupy a nation or a region, but these chapters wholly exist to bridge eras and establish a family lineage between major events at the start of Genesis. They're necessary, but they're probably the least valuable to read in the book. Just above the population of the world, we have Judah and Tamar. Judah, the fourth son of Jacob, marries a Canaanite and has 3 sons. This is relatively significant because his predecessors in Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham all married other Hebrews, with Abraham and Isaac being very insistent that their sons do not marry natives of the land, but instead marry to their own people. Judah's first 2 sons are killed by God for being wicked. I'm not sure why the firstborn died, but the second is killed because he spilled his seed instead of impregnating his firstborn's widow, Tamar, and raising the child. Afterwards, Judah sends Tamar to live alone and take no man until his 3rd son, Shelah, becomes of age. One day, after his wife had died, Judah is beset by a prostitute and impregnates her, discovering later that this prostitute was Tamar. This story is really boring, and I don't really know what it was for. It comes at a relatively interesting point in Genesis, and it doesn't really matter much to the broader scope of things. The Life of Jacob Part 2 picks up Jacob's story as he returns to the land of his fathers. One of the natives of Canaan, Shechem the Hivite, kidnaps Jacob's daughter Dinah and wishes to marry her. His father, Hamor, goes to speak to Jacob and ask for his permission, imploring upon them to intermarry with their people and they will open the lands to them. Jacob is pretty apprehensive, but ultimately does nothing. But Jacob's sons Simeon and Levi are furious. They decide to trick the Hivites, saying that Dinah cannot marry into a people who are uncircumcised, for those who are uncircumcised are not protected by God. And if all of the men are circumcised, Shechem can marry their sister. The Hivites agree, and then Simeon and Levi murder them 3 days later. There's a brief addendum about Jacob having his final son with his wife Rachel named Benjamin, and God promising that the land he occupies will be his and his children's. This story is the worst of Jacob's, in that it is one of the worst stories in the book of Genesis. Every Jacob story involves some atrocity being committed by him or his flock, and then God promises him and his flock the land, for they are blessed by God. It's eternally frustrating, and I don't enjoy reading it. Chapters 32 and 33 of Genesis is my biggest disappointment of the book. Coming in, I knew the greatest hits of Genesis, but one story I knew was that of Jacob wrestling God, refusing to yield unless he was blessed and being rechristened Israel. I was excited to read the story because it sounded very interesting and fit into one of the prophet's stories much differently than the others listed in Genesis. But the story about Jacob wrestling God is actually just a paragraph in the middle of a more interesting story of Jacob returning to the land of his fathers, but fearing his brother Esau, as Jacob had stolen his birthright and his father's blessing before fleeing his retribution. To this end, he sends offerings and splits up his sons and wives so that if he is beset upon by Esau, his entire family might not be slain. Esau meets him and greets him as a brother and attempts to rebuke his offering, and Jacob purchases land in Canaan and sets up his tent and settles there. It's a story that ultimately does not live up to the SparkNotes summary that you would read before diving in. The Life of Abraham Part 3 comes at the end of the prophet Abraham's life, seeing the death of his wife Sarah and his finding a wife for his son Isaac. That is basically all that happens, but it didn't bother me like the previous stories. The Life of Abraham Part 1, conversely, is the beginning of Abraham's life. Named Abram at the time and a descendant of Shem, son of Noah, Abraham is bid by God to leave his homeland, and in return, God will make him a great nation. To this end, Abraham wanders for many years, briefly staying in Egypt and telling the king that his wife Sarah was his sister, fearing that they would kill him if they knew he was married because there is no fear of God's wrath in Egypt. Eventually, Abram settles in Canaan, where God promises him that the land will belong to his offspring. There's a small side story of his nephew Lot being abducted during an unrelated war as he was staying near the kingdom of Sodom, and Abraham leads a siege to destroy the offenders and regain the goods that were stolen. In the end, Abraham is given a prophetic vision by God, who says that his descendants will be enslaved and mistreated in a foreign land for 400 years. But once they return, his descendants will return to Canaan and the land will be theirs. It's a very eventful collection of stories with a tease for entirely separate books, but individually, these stories are not terribly interesting, but it's the most interesting of the stories so far. Creation is probably the most well-known story of Genesis. God creating heaven and earth, the land and the sky, and all of the animals, and resting on the seventh day. It has a couple of silly things that I can only attribute to translation issues. God famously says, "Let there be light" on the first day, creating the heaven and the earth along with the light. But on the fourth day, he makes the stars, the sun, and the moon, saying that the sun and moon are the lights of their domains, which is different from the light from day one. These are all well-known, silly questions regarding the creation story. My personal favorite is that there is a distinction between fish, birds, and all of the other animals, which I imagine only means that animals refers to land-dwelling creatures, while fish and birds do not dwell there. All told, it's well known, but who wants to hear the big radio hit lead off the album? Noah's Ark is a reset of the story up to this point. Following the original sin of Adam and Eve and their population of the world, God has come to regret the creation of man because their nature is wicked and selfish. But he finds favor in Noah, who is a descendant of Adam and presumably the only person who remains who is still a man of God. Because of this, God decides to flood the world and destroy humanity, but grants Noah the means with which to survive. An extremely specific, I can't stress this enough, specific down to the measurement blueprint for a great ark with which to avoid destruction. Now, you think you know the rest of the story. Two of every animal, rainbow to symbolize a pact with man to never flood the world again, but you'd be missing two things. First, it's not exactly two of every animal. God says that Noah is to gather 7 pairs of every clean animal and 1 pair of every unclean animal, but he doesn't specify what those are. He was very specific with the measurements of the ark and where doors should be placed, but I don't know which animals are clean and unclean. The second is the end, which contains information that is incredibly important to the story of the Israelites. After the flood, Noah has a vineyard and gets drunk off of wine and passes out naked, only to be found by his son Ham, who goes and tells his brothers Shem and Japheth. Shem and Japheth enter the room backwards and put a blanket on Noah, covering his shame. Because of this, Noah curses Ham's son Canaan, saying that Canaan will be the lowest of slaves and will serve Shem and Japheth. There is a debate on what this story means, whether Canaan was the one who saw Noah's nakedness, or if he was cursed for his father's sin, or what the nature of this curse means. Some point to it being a justification for the Israelites claiming the lands of Canaan, and others use it to explain the dark skin of the region's natives. Either way, Noah curses a child because they saw his cock and ball, and that's why Canaan is promised to Abraham and his descendants, and why the Hebrews are not to marry Canaanites. It's an insane story that basically ends the prelude of Genesis before getting to the first main character, the prophet Abraham. The life of Abraham part 2 takes place after Sodom and Gomorrah. God delivers on a promise he made to Abraham to give him and his wife a son named Isaac, and also Abraham goes to a Philistine city, does the same con with Sarah where he says she is his sister, and afterwards makes a pact with the Philistine king and digs a well as a sign of good faith. This story is much better in context than it is on its own, and that's why it's above Noah's Ark. Land of Goshen is the finale of Genesis, which sees Jacob and the Israelites migrate to the land of Goshen at the behest of his lost son Joseph, who has become a great lord of Egypt and brought his people there to escape a plague. It ends with the blessing of Jacob, which is a famous and honestly kind of insane portion of the Bible where Jacob, who has been a piece of shit who has benefited from stolen blessings and other people's forgiveness for hundreds of years, prophesies what will happen to the 12 tribes of Israel on his deathbed. He says that his oldest son Reuben is as turbulent as the waters and will no longer excel, dismisses Simeon and Levi as weapons of violence who will be scattered and dispersed, and says that Issachar is a raw-boned donkey laying down among sheep pens. That last one is 100% real, by the way. Genesis 49:14. Look it up. There's also a brief bit where Joseph's brothers are concerned for their fate after Jacob's death, so they tell him that Jacob said to forgive them. It's basically just the story of how the Hebrews came to Egypt, where they are found 400 years later at the start of Exodus. The son of Abraham comes at a conflicting time in Abraham's story. His wife Sarah is unable to bear children, and they're both old, but God has promised him that the lands of Canaan will belong to his descendants. Despite this promise, he fears that he will have no descendants, so Sarah tells him to impregnate her Egyptian servant, which produces his son Ishmael. Years later, God renames Abram to Abraham and promises Sarah will bear children, leading both Sarah and Abraham to laugh in disbelief, which is what leads to the naming of their child Isaac, which means he will laugh in Hebrew. There are all kinds of little details about how Sarah treats her servant after Ishmael is born, God blessing Ishmael in a backhanded way, an odd story about 3 men asking Abraham for water, and I'm not sure if they're meant to be God or not. And all of that contributes to a pretty nifty story about the bits of doubt that Abraham has in God's prophecy, even though he serves him without question. The life of Joseph follows Joseph after he is sold as a slave to Egypt. Because he is favored by God, he succeeds in whatever he does, so he's able to rise up to being a respected attendant in Egypt, only to be framed by an official's wife for sexual assault and thrown in prison. In prison, Jacob interprets the dreams of the Pharaoh's cupbearer, and in return, he asks the cupbearer to request that he is released from prison, as he does not belong there. The cupbearer forgets about him, but 2 years later, when the Pharaoh is having dreams he cannot explain, Joseph is released, revealing that the dreams are God's prophecy of a famine. As a reward, Joseph is appointed a great lord of Egypt, second only to the Pharaoh himself. While much of the book of Genesis is accounting of history, I think that I enjoy Joseph's stories because he is not self-serving or an undeserving beneficiary of God's blessing as their father Jacob has been. But instead, this part of the story can be viewed as a parable for the law of attraction. The idea that if you are good and just, even if you are punished, your reward will be tenfold as the good and just are favored. Genesis is not a book of metaphors, but these interpretations are what let Joseph's stories rank so high while Jacob's stories rank so low. Coat of Many Colors is a pretty major story, as this is how Joseph ends up in Egypt. Joseph is favored by his father Jacob, who gives him a beautiful ornate coat. Joseph has a dream that sees him and his brothers binding wheat, and his wheat stands upright while his brothers bow to him, which his brothers interpret as a prophecy that they will bow to Joseph and decide to kill him. They ultimately decide to sell Joseph as a slave to passing Midianites, as they can be rid of him without causing harm, circumventing the sin of fratricide. The Midianites sell him as a slave to Egypt, and the rest of the story goes into motion. But this is a fun little story about jealousy and bitterness and inheritance that is made more powerful by the preceding stories about Jacob and his lack of respect for birthright or succession. If creation is the most known story in Genesis, Adam and Eve has to be the second. There's no real point in recapping Adam and Eve because we all know it. God creates a man in his image, decides that a man alone is a sad thing, and creates a woman, telling them they can do whatever they want except eat from this tree. A serpent representing Satan comes and tells Eve that if they eat the fruit, they will become all-knowing like God, tempting them into committing the original sin and gaining the knowledge of good and evil. The most interesting part of Adam and Eve is the way that God discovers they ate the fruit. When God comes to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve hide because they're naked and ashamed. God asks why they hid, and they said that they were naked. And God asks, "Who told you that you were naked?" I think it's an interesting distinction. Man is born naked and is taught that is to be hidden, thus covering up God's image. He resolves that they cannot remain in heaven and gives them clothes and casts them down to earth. I think that the more I read Genesis, the more I liked Adam and Eve because the different ideas of God's perspectives became more clear. But the story is at its best as a framing of mankind's inherent nature, one that is steeped in selfishness and indulgence that they cannot avoid any more than they can avoid breathing. The Life of Jacob Part 1 takes place after Jacob leaves his home and goes to Paddan Aram to find a wife from his own people, as Isaac had. On the way, he sleeps on a stone and is visited by God, who tells him all of the regular shit about how Canaan is promised to him and his descendants, and they will be as plentiful as the stars. Jacob wakes up and says that this place is awesome because the Lord is here. That is not paraphrasing. That is directly from the Bible. Genesis 28:17. He says the place is so kick-ass, dude, and he names the spot Bethel, which you'd think is Bethlehem, but it's not. Jacob continues to Paddan Aram and speaks to his uncle or grandfather or both, a man named Laban, who invites Jacob in, and Jacob falls in love with one of his daughters, Rachel. Jacob tells Laban that he will work for 7 years if he can take Rachel as a wife. Laban agrees, but he hoodwinks Jacob, switching out Rachel for his elder daughter Leah in bed, saying that it is not their custom to wed a younger daughter while the older remains unmarried, forcing Jacob to work another 7 years before he can marry Rachel. I love this story because I view it as Jacob's penance for stealing his older brother Esau's birthright. He shirked the line of inheritance to be blessed by his father, so he must toil away for twice as long as promised because of someone else's customs regarding lineage. It's the only time in all of Jacob's stories that Jacob approaches being punished for his deceit and trickery, a thing he avoids because he is blessed by God. There are a lot of stories in the book of Genesis that people like to make fun of. Oh, creation, he made the world but he got sleepy. Oh, Noah's Ark, he got all those animals on there. Isn't that silly? It's usually the early stories that defy the idea of humanity that are so ripe for the picking for non-believers. And it's a shame that those are the greatest hits for jokesters, because easily the most insane story in the book of Genesis comes in the form of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel comes after Noah's Ark, and presumably after a large part of the population has been restored, because it is said that the world were all one people with one language, coming together to build a great city and a great tower, one large enough to reach the heavens. God sees this and decides that if man were to build this tower, then nothing would be impossible to them. So to prevent them from accomplishing this, God separated the people and cursed them with confusion, causing them to not understand one another, which created different languages, before casting people separately across the earth, explaining why there are different races and cultures. Truly, this is the most unhinged and hasty explanation for why there are different people and races and languages. People just tried to build a big building, and God said, "Holy shit, that's so big," and made some people Chinese. I'm fascinated by this story because if the Bible were a book of parables, you can interpret this as God being fearful of a single ideology, no matter what it is. Because then it would only take a little bit of corruption for all of the people to once again become wicked as they were before the flood. To this end, God sought to create a diversity of thought and experience at the expense of unity of man. It's a fascinating concept that I think more stories should draw from than do currently, because I feel like only Metal Gear Solid 5 is out there saying that what divides people is not race, but language. The 12 Children of Jacob is also an insane story. After he marries Rachel, God makes her unable to bear children, and it's not explained why. Instead, his first wife Leah bears 4 children, the first 3 born of her misery, and the 4th born praising God. Out of jealousy, Rachel wants Jacob to impregnate a slave of hers so that she could at least raise a child, even if she could not bear it. What happens afterwards is a passive-aggressive war for bearing Jacob's children. Another slave gets involved, they haggle and trade over it, and Jacob has 11 children before God remembers that Rachel cannot bear children and allows her to, giving birth to his 12th child, Joseph. After the birth of Joseph, Jacob wishes to leave Laban's homestead and build his own, but Laban has been the beneficiary of Jacob's blessing and wishes to keep him around and continue reaping. There's some classic Jacob trickery where he works with Laban's livestock, and because he's blessed, all the animal he works with are strong and he can lay claim to, leaving the weak ones for Laban. Jacob escapes like a thief in the night, and Laban is angry, but ultimately lets Jacob go. It's a completely ridiculous yet captivating read, and also the last good Jacob story, because everything else he does sucks. Joseph, Lord of Egypt, details how Joseph, with his knowledge of the incoming famine, power in Egypt, and the fortune of God, is able to build such a storage of grain that not only will Egypt survive the famine, but they will be the only nation to have grain and be able to trade it with the world. The payoff comes when a group of Hebrews travel from Canaan to Egypt to buy grain. Joseph is beset by the brothers who sold him as a slave and seek to purchase food. There are tests that Joseph puts them through. He wants to see if they are willing to sell their youngest brother Benjamin, the favored and protected of Jacob now that Joseph is presumed dead. He wants to see if they will return if they are granted the opportunity to hoard silver. But ultimately, Joseph, as a good and just man, reveals himself and forgives them, providing them the land of Goshen that they can settle upon to avoid the further destruction of famine. I love this story because of all of God's favored, Joseph is the only one who has no direct communication with God because he is not blessed by his father. He is able to act through God's favor, and he uses that to benefit people, both the Hebrews and the Egyptians. Joseph is presented as an honest man who would be more than justified in casting his brothers aside for selling him to Egypt. But instead, he views it not as them who sent him to Egypt, but God. Because if he didn't go to Egypt, he would not have gained the Pharaoh's power and could not have prepared for the famine, and thus his and all people would die. It's the ultimate rewarding moment in the book of Genesis, a time when a good man's belief in the right thing allows him to provide sanctuary for the Israelites in the lands he has adopted. Sodom and Gomorrah is the most fucked up story of the Bible. The wicked and evil cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed by God for their wickedness. The only one being spared is the man who fears God's wrath. The details of Sodom and Gomorrah, however, are what make it more than just a cautionary tale of punishing sin, and what also makes it interesting. Before God ventures to Sodom and Gomorrah, he confides in Abraham what he is planning to do. And Abraham, despite being promised a son and a nation by God, questions him. If you were to wipe out Sodom and Gomorrah, you would wipe out any potential good in order to wash away evil. It draws an interesting distinction. Presumably, nobody in Sodom and Gomorrah believe in God, or at least do not fear his wrath because they act in sin. But Abraham believes that despite that, there might be good people in the city, giving birth to the idea that there could be good people who do not believe in God, which is contrary to God's perspective since original sin, that man cannot be good because they are base and selfish, and the best they can do is give themselves to the will of God. Abraham negotiates with God for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, asking if God is willing to kill 50 good people to cleanse the wicked, with God agreeing that if there are 50 good people, he would spare them. Only for Abraham to counter, well, what if there are 45? Would you truly kill them if you are 5 short? Again, it presents this idea that life is valuable, that just one good person being killed in order to rid the world of 1,000 evils is not worth it. God eventually sends angels down to Sodom and Gomorrah to try and find good people, only for the men of the city to try to rape them, so God rains sulfur down and kills all life. And then he turns Lot's wife into a pillar of salt, and then his daughters rape him in his sleep to get pregnant. I think that Sodom and Gomorrah exists as a point of contention during Abraham's journey. Before this, he is told that he will have a son from God, and he laughs in disbelief. Then he disapproves of God's actions in Sodom and Gomorrah, and then his son is born, showing the duality of God's favor and of his wrath. If Sodom and Gomorrah is the inciting incident of Abraham's potential doubting of God, and the birth of Isaac is what shows him that God is capable of anything, then the binding of Isaac is the ultimate climax to those two ideas. Isaac is Abraham and Sarah's son, the heir who will inherit Abraham's will and is living proof of God's dedication to Abraham and his descendants. God must have been feeling pretty down on the prospect of man after Sodom and Gomorrah and being doubted about his miracle of birth by his prophet, so he calls to Abraham, "Bring your son Isaac to the mountain and sacrifice him for my favor." Abraham obliges, bringing Isaac to a mountain and binding him, preparing to offer him as a sacrifice to God before an angel stops him, revealing that this was a test given by the Lord to show that he was willing to sacrifice his only true son, the miracle child gifted to him through the grace of God. It's a famous story that cements Abraham and his son Isaac as the prophets of God's will, the ultimate test of faith to show that man is worth entering a pact with. It's a moment of man's redemption in the eyes of God, a sign that all temptation can be laid in front of them, and if they are committed, they would still fear God's word. Given this context, it's probably the most important story in the book of Genesis, and the first that I believe is legitimately captivating. Realistically, the story of Isaac, Jacob, and Esau should be two stories. There's the story of Isaac traveling to the Philistine city of Gerar, where he is granted land, but due to his blessing by God and his bountiful harvests, he is ousted by the king because of his citizens' jealousy. In their contempt, the Philistines destroyed the wells that were dug by Isaac's father Abraham, and also prevented Isaac from digging new wells. It's an interesting story because I'm like 90% sure that this is at least the origin of the Israel and Palestine conflict. If not in practice, then in sequence. Then there is the story of Jacob and Esau, the sons of Isaac who God speaks a prophecy of. One will be stronger, and the older will serve the younger. Esau is born first, with Jacob being born gripping his heel. And while Esau is favored by his father, Jacob is favored by his mother, who conspires with Jacob to inherit all that Isaac has to offer. First is Esau's birthright, the lands that Isaac has to offer. Jacob trades Esau a bowl of soup for his birthright when Esau is starving and has no need for his birthright. Then is Isaac's blessing, the passing of God's word that has been gifted to him by Abraham. Jacob tricks Isaac into blessing him by pretending to be Esau, and there is a genuinely sad exchange when Esau realizes what happened, where he begs to be blessed by Isaac, asking, "Do you only have one blessing?" Esau vows to kill his brother, so Rebekah sends him away, ultimately leading to Jacob going to Haran to find a wife. Isaac's stories with the Philistines comes in the middle of these two, and the pairing of Jacob stealing Esau's birthright and blessing comes in a pair, so it didn't feel right to split them up. But these two are extremely good stories filled with captivating drama, and I don't know how you can read it without thinking that Jacob is a real-life demon who stole the word of God. I don't know how Jacob is regarded, but in my house, it is with nothing but contempt. The greatest hits of the book of Genesis largely come in its first four stories that serve as a prelude to Abraham, God's first prophet. The stories after Abraham, those of Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, are rife with a common theme: the conflict between brothers to earn favor with their father and thus with God. The ideas presented in the prelude to Abraham persist throughout the Israelite lineage, chief among them being man and their proximity to wickedness. How children of God are always on a razor's edge to their own twisted nature brought upon by original sin, and only by conquering those base desires inherent to man and accepting God's love will you receive his favor. If these themes are prevalent in all stories of the children of Abraham, then the story of Cain and Abel must be the greatest story in the book of Genesis. This is one of the book's greatest hits, but I love this story so much that I will still recap. As Adam and Eve are cast to earth, their first children are named Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel provide offerings to God. Cain worked in the field, and Abel worked with livestock, and God prefers Abel's offering, which upsets Cain. God tells Cain that he shouldn't be jealous of Abel, to offer what he can, and that will be enough. But blind to God's word, Cain gives in to his jealousy and kills his brother. When God returns, he asks Cain where Abel is, to which Cain shrugs and replies with the iconic line, "Am I my brother's keeper?" God declares the land that Cain worked to be cursed as it has absorbed his brother's blood, and forces Cain to be an aimless wanderer for all of his days. In some of the best stories of Genesis, the coat of many colors, Jacob and Esau, Joseph, Lord of Egypt, there is a core presented of conflict between brothers, ultimately over the favor of God. And the question of, am I my brother's keeper, rings through each of these, with the resolution being a resounding yes. I can be frustrated by Esau forgiving Jacob or Joseph forgiving his brothers. But when you read Cain and Abel, the ultimate message is that even if you are jealous of your kin, it is your duty to keep them safe and away from harm, lest you be cursed. You could see this idea permeate an infinite amount of stories. The sin of fratricide is regarded as one of the most evil and unforgivable of all because, before anything, you are your brother's keeper. Cain and Abel is not a complex story, and it doesn't have long-reaching direct implications. Adam ends up having another son, and it's that son who goes on to produce the lineage of the chosen people through Noah and Abraham. But it's Cain and Abel that stands on its own as being the most impactful story in the book of Genesis. You won't create a religion around it or teach history with the story of Cain and Abel, but you should use it to understand your duty to your fellow man. If you take the book of Genesis literally, or you take it as a collection of metaphors and parables to guide morality, Cain and Abel holds to both as the depiction of the most vile of all sins, as it was the first sin committed with the knowledge of good and evil. It is the embodiment of every decision that is made knowing it will hurt others. And truly, there is no sin greater than that.